I poured myself a coffee dark roast, no sugar, the way I've had it every morning for 40 years, and stood at the kitchen window of my new house watching the snow settle over the backyard. 3 acres in Collingwood, Ontario. A wraparound porch I built myself on weekends. A wood stove in the living room that I lit every evening just because I could. I had earned this. Every single square foot of it. I didn't win a lottery. I didn't inherit anything. My father left me his toolbox and a handshake when he died, and that was more than enough. I spent 32 years building Fletcher custom cabinetry from a one-car garage in Barrie into a business with 14 employees and contracts all across the province. School renovations, hospital millwork, custom kitchens for houses I could never have afforded myself. Not until I sold a company 3 years ago for just over $2 million. I was 63. My knees hurt. My back hurt worse. And for the first time in my adult life, I had nowhere to be on a Monday morning. I should tell you about my son. His name is Owen. He is 38 years old, and he has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness. And somewhere along the way, he stopped being someone I recognized. I cannot tell you exactly when it happened. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe I missed the signs because I was always working, always driving somewhere with a truck full of cabinet doors, always telling myself I would slow down next year. But by the time I sold the business, Owen and I had not spoken in 4 years. His wife's name is Renata. I want to be fair when I talk about her because she is the mother of my granddaughter, and I do not think she is a stupid woman. But I think she decided very early in her marriage that I was a problem to be managed, and she managed me right out of the picture. It started small, missed calls that were never returned, Christmas dinners I was not invited to, a birthday party for my granddaughter Emma that I found out about 3 weeks after it happened, when I saw the photos on Facebook. When I asked Owen about it, he said Renata had handed the invitations and there must have been a miscommunication. That was the word he used. Miscommunication. Like 4 years of silence was a scheduling error. Emma was born when Owen was 27. I was at the hospital. I held her when she was 40 minutes old. She had this tiny frown on her face like she was already disappointed in something. And I laughed so hard the nurse asked me to step into the hallway. For the first 2 years of her life, I saw her every few weeks. Then Renata went back to work and things shifted. And the visits became monthly, then occasional. And then they just stopped. Emma was 12 the last time I saw her. She is 16 now. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from being erased from your own family. It does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates the way snow accumulates, quietly, steadily, until one morning you look out the window and you can't see the ground anymore. I grieved. I kept working. I sold the business. I bought the house in Collingwood and I told myself that the next chapter was mine to write, and I meant it. My neighbor Pete knows everybody in town, and he introduced me to a retired teacher named Karen, who became my closest friend in those first 2 years. She had lost her own husband and was sharp and funny and had no patience for self-pity, including mine. She was the one who talked me into joining the curling league at the Risk Center. She was the one who said, the night I told her the whole story about Owen and Renata over a bottle of Malbec, "You didn't fail him, Lawrence. He chose convenience over character." I think about that sentence a lot. I also have a lawyer. His name is Frank Okafor, and he went to school with my accountant, and he has been handling my affairs for 12 years. Frank is not a warm man. He is precise and careful, and he speaks like every word costs something. But I trust him completely. When I sold the company, Frank structured the sale. When I bought the Collingwood property, Frank reviewed the title. When things started to happen, and they did start to happen, Frank was the first person I called. It was a Tuesday in February when Owen called me. I recognized the number immediately, even though I had not seen it light up my phone in 4 years. I sat with it for 2 rings. Then I picked up. He said, "Dad," and something in my chest cracked open a little, even though I knew better. Even though the rational part of my brain was already asking, why now? What does he want? We talked for 20 minutes. He sounded tired. He told me things had been difficult, vague, the way he was always vague when the truth was inconvenient. He said Renata had been going through some things. He said he'd been thinking about me. He asked how the house was coming along, which told me he already knew about the house, which meant someone had been checking on me from a distance for some time. He said he wanted to see me. I said yes. I said, come up for the weekend. I said, bring Emma. Renata came too. They arrived on a Friday evening in two cars. Owen in his Jeep, Renata in a new Audi that I did not remember from 4 years ago. Emma had grown into someone I barely knew. She was tall and quiet, and she looked at me with something careful in her eyes, like she was waiting to see if I was safe. My own granddaughter. Dinner was polite. Owen asked about the house, and I told him about the renovation I'd done on the back porch. Renata asked about the town, and I told her about the farmers market on Saturdays. Emma said almost nothing. After dinner, while Owen and I cleaned up, Renata wandered through the house the way people do when they are not looking at anything in particular, but actually cataloging everything. I noticed. I did not say anything. I made tea and brought it out to the living room, and we sat by the wood stove and talked until 10 o'clock, and it almost felt normal. Almost. Before they went to bed, Renata said, and this was the moment I would replay in my head many times afterward. She said, Lawrence, this house is so big for one person. It must feel lonely rattling around in here. I said I didn't find it lonely at all. She smiled. She said, well, we should talk more this weekend. The next morning, over breakfast, the conversation began in earnest. Owen said they'd been having some financial difficulties. I asked what kind of difficulties. He said the mortgage on their house in Barry had become hard to manage, that Renata's hours had been cut at her firm, that things were tight. He said it carefully, with the measured tone of someone who has rehearsed. He said they had been thinking, and at this point, Renata came into the kitchen and sat down, which told me this moment had been choreographed. They had been thinking that it might make sense given the size of my house, given that I was living alone, given the extra rooms if they moved in, temporarily. Just until they got back on their feet. I want to tell you what it felt like. Sitting at my own kitchen table, in my house that I had earned, being asked this by a son who had not spoken to me in 4 years. I want to describe it accurately. It felt like being handed a bill for someone else's dinner. I kept my voice level. I asked a few questions. How long did they mean by temporarily? Owen said 6 months, maybe a year. Did they have a plan for the mortgage on their Barry house? Renata said they would rent it out. What was the rental income going to look like? Renata had an answer for everything, which confirmed that this was not a spontaneous conversation. This had been planned for some time. After breakfast, I told them I needed to think about it. I went out to the workshop I'd set up in the garage, and I stood at my workbench for a long time. And then I called Frank. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, don't agree to anything today. Tell them you need 2 weeks. And Lawrence, check your property records this week. I want to make sure everything is clean before people are living in that house. I did not understand what he meant at the time. I did understand within 10 days. While Owen and Renata were staying for the weekend, I was cordial. I showed Owen the workshop. I took Emma down to the harbor on Saturday morning because she had mentioned she liked photography, and I had an old film camera I thought she might want to try. That hour at the harbor was the first real thing that happened all weekend. Emma relaxed when it was just the two of us. She pointed her camera at the ice-locked boats and the grey sky, and she said, without looking up, I'm sorry, Grandpa, I didn't know you were trying to see me. I had to look away so she wouldn't see my face. I said, I know, sweetheart, none of that is on you. On Sunday afternoon, when they were packing to leave, Renata found me in the kitchen and told me she had noticed I kept the second bedroom exactly as a guest room, that there was also a room off the hall that could work as a child's bedroom, and the third room near the stairs would be perfect for a home office. She said it with the confidence of someone who had already done the floor plan in her head. I realized she had not been touring the house out of admiration. She had been making decisions. I told her I'd be in touch after I'd had time to think. The drive home to Barry is about an hour, and according to my phone records, Renata called me 3 times in the following week. Owen called once. I let most of those go to voicemail. I was busy. Frank had found something. There was no lien on my property, no issue with the title. But in his due diligence, he had spoken to my accountant Barry, who had been contacted the previous month by someone asking questions about the value of my estate. The inquiry had come through an intermediary, and the intermediary, when Frank traced it carefully, was Renata's brother. I sat with that information for a day. Then I made some phone calls of my own. I called a friend of mine named Bert, who had retired from the OPP and who still had contacts. I called Barry again and asked him to tell me everything about the inquiry. I called my insurance broker to ask a hypothetical question about what would happen to my estate if a family member were living in my home under a verbal arrangement. The answer to that last question was illuminating in a way that confirmed everything I was beginning to understand. Renata was not trying to move into my house to save money on a mortgage. She was trying to establish a claim. I am not a lawyer and I won't use legal language I don't fully understand. But what Frank explained to me was this. In Ontario, depending on the circumstances, a dependent family member who establishes residency in a property and can demonstrate financial reliance on the property owner can, under certain conditions, make legal claims on that estate. It is not simple, it is not guaranteed, but it is also not impossible, especially when there is no formal written agreement, especially when the property owner is elderly and living alone, and especially when there is documentation suggesting the dependent relied on that arrangement for housing. Renata's brother was a paralegal. I thought about Emma. I thought about her standing at the harbor with my old camera, saying she hadn't known I was trying to see her. I thought about the fact that nobody had told her. That she had grown up without a grandfather because the adults around her had decided it was more convenient that way. And now those same adults were prepared to use her proximity to me, her real, genuine need for a grandfather, as part of a strategy to eventually take my house. I was furious. I was also, once I let the fury settle, very clear. I told Owen and Renata I needed more time. I was warm about it. I said I was genuinely touched. They'd reached out. That it meant a lot to me. That I wanted to make sure we did this right. Renata's voice changed on the phone, became easier, more familiar. And I let that happen. I let her think the conversation was going the way she'd planned. Meanwhile, Frank drafted a formal document, a cohabitation and property agreement, that would, if signed, make clear that any living arrangement in my home carried zero property rights, zero claim on my estate, and included a clause requiring 30 days written notice to vacate under standard Ontario tenancy exceptions. He also added a provision protecting Emma's visits independently of whatever arrangement her parents had with me, because I was not going to let that girl's access to me be contingent on her mother's good behavior. I also changed my will. I'm not going to tell you that part was easy. Sitting in Frank's office in Barrie on a cold Thursday afternoon, signing a new will that specifically addressed this situation. It was not easy. I thought about who I had expected Owen to become. I thought about the boy who used to sit in the workshop with me on Saturday mornings and hand me tools and ask how everything worked. I thought about how far that boy was from the man who had sent his wife to make decisions about my bedroom layout before he'd even asked me how I was doing. I spent 34 years in construction management. And the one thing this industry, 34 years in industry, made think this industry think this to was ready to talk, and the one grateful for that. I called Owen in April. I told him I had thought it over and that I wanted to have a proper conversation about their situation before making any decisions. I invited them for a second visit. I said I wanted to involve Emma in planning because I thought she was old enough to be part of family conversations. Renata agreed to this so quickly that I understood Emma had been part of the original plan, that having Emma there would soften me, which was something they understood about me even if they had not been present for 4 years. They came on a Saturday. This time, I had also invited Pete from next door for dinner and Karen Barry. I introduced him as a friend from my Barry days, which was not entirely untrue. I made a roast. I had wine. It was a good evening in the way that evenings can be good even when you are watching someone very carefully. Over dinner, Pete asked Owen what he did for work, and Owen explained his logistics job in Barrie. And Pete said, "Good work, stable." Renata talked about her career at the firm and how the industry had been affected by changes in the market. Barry asked a few questions that sounded like small talk and were not. After dinner, when the others were in the living room, I sat with Owen alone at the kitchen table. I said, "I want to be straight with you." He looked at me, and for a moment he looked young again. He looked like he was 12 years old and he had done something wrong and he knew I knew. I said, "I know about the inquiry to Barry's office. I know who made it and why." I watched his face. He didn't deny it. He looked down at the table and he rubbed the back of his neck and he said quietly, "That wasn't my idea, Dad." I believed him. I think it was the truest thing he said to me that whole visit. I said, "I know." I told him that I was willing to have a real relationship, that I was willing to help him financially if things were genuinely difficult, within reason and within formal documentation. That I wanted to know Emma. That those things were available to him. Then I told him what was not available. The house was not available as a residence. There would be no informal arrangement, no undocumented cohabitation, no slow establishment of residency. If he needed money to manage the Barry mortgage, he could speak with Frank and we could discuss a formal loan with paperwork. If Renata had concerns about that arrangement, she was welcome to have her own lawyer review it. Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She's not going to like this." I said, "I know." He said, "This might cause problems." I said, "Owen, she contacted my accountant through her brother to assess the value of my estate before she asked me if she could move in. She made decisions about my spare bedrooms before I agreed to anything. I am 66 years old and I am not confused about what that means." He didn't say anything after that. Renata took it about as well as I expected. She became polite in the way that people become polite when they are deciding their next move. She said she appreciated my transparency. She said she understood my concerns. She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and she thanked me for the roast. They left at 9 o'clock. Pete caught my eye on the way out and raised his eyebrows just slightly. Barry shook my hand at the door and said, "Good evening, Lawrence," and I knew he meant more than the dinner. 3 weeks later, Owen called me without Renata. He said it had been a difficult conversation at their end. He said she was angry. He said she felt humiliated. I let him talk. Then I asked him what he wanted to do, not what she wanted, not what was convenient, what he wanted. There was a long pause. He said he wanted his daughter to know her grandfather. He said he thought he'd made some choices in the past 10 years that he wasn't proud of. He said it plainly, without drama, and I think that took something from him. I said, "Then let's start there." Emma started coming up on her own that summer. Owen drove her on the first visit. She had her own camera by then, a used film camera she'd found at a market in Barrie, and she spent the first afternoon photographing the property, the wood stove, the old tools in my workshop. She ate 3 pieces of rhubarb pie and told me about her plans to study environmental science at Guelph after she graduated. I told her about my father's toolbox. I told her about the first cabinet I ever built, which was lopsided and too small, and I was prouder of it than almost anything I'd built since. I told her some things about her dad when he was young. Good things, the kind of things a kid deserves to know about her parent. She told me about 4 years of not understanding why her grandfather wasn't there. She said it quietly and without accusation, just as a fact she had carried around and never known what to do with. I said I was sorry it happened that way. I said I hoped we had time to make up for it. She came back the following month. She brought a friend the time after that. By the end of summer, she knew how to fire the wood stove, where I kept the good tea, and the names of every boat in the harbor. Owen and Renata are still in their Barry house. They did not move in. Owen and I have had several conversations, some of them difficult, none of them ending in silence. The formal loan did not happen. His financial situation turned out to be less acute than presented, which Frank noted without surprise, but the conversation about it forced a kind of honesty that I think was overdue. Renata and I are cordial in the way that two people can be cordial when they understand each other clearly. I do not expect more than that. What I have is Emma. I have a 16-year-old who texts me photographs of clouds and links to articles about boreal forest ecosystems and asks me occasionally for advice about people and situations the way young people do when they trust you. I have her in my kitchen on holidays now. I have her opinion on whether I should repaint the workshop and her laughter when I say something that sounds like something her father would say. That is not nothing. In fact, it is most of what matters. I am 66 years old, and I live alone in a house I built myself out of work and patience. The property taxes in Simcoe County are real and the winters are long, and the snow last February was genuinely unreasonable. But I drink my coffee by the window every morning and I watch the light come up over the backyard and I think, I know who I am. I know what I built. And I know the difference between people who want to be in your life and people who want access to it. That difference, once you see it clearly, changes everything. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Emma standing at the harbor in February, pointing my old camera at the frozen boats, saying she didn't know I had been trying to see her. She said it without anger, just as a fact. And that fact, quiet and plain as it was, told me everything I needed to understand about how cause and consequence actually work in a family. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to lose someone. It happens in small choices accumulated over years. Renata's choices, Owen's silence, my own tendency to keep working instead of pushing harder for what mattered. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and those consequences landed on a 16-year-old girl who grew up thinking her grandfather simply wasn't there. That's the part people don't always reckon with. It's easy to look at what Renata did. The inquiry through her brother, the bedroom calculations, the strategy disguised as family, and call it scheming. And it was. But what made it possible was years of smaller erosions that nobody stopped. I think about that. I think about the moments I let the unanswered cause slide because I didn't want conflict, and how that restraint was not the same thing as wisdom. There's a difference between keeping your dignity and going quiet when you should have spoken. I confused those two things for longer than I should have. What I eventually understood is that clear thinking is not cold thinking. When Frank traced the inquiry back to Renata's brother, I felt the fury first. That heat in your chest when you realize the story you told yourself about someone was not the story they were living. But I let it settle before I moved. That's not patience for its own sake. That's the discipline of understanding that a decision made in anger protects your ego and not much else. I had one real chance to handle this in a way that kept Emma in my life, and I was not going to waste it on a reaction. I also had to be honest with myself about Owen. He was not innocent. That wasn't my idea, is not the same as I tried to stop it. He let things happen because it was easier than standing between his wife and his father, and that's a failure of character he's going to have to work out on his own terms over time. I can have a relationship with him without pretending otherwise. I can leave the door open without leaving it unlocked. What I want for Emma, what I think about when she texts me a photograph of something she noticed on her way to school, is that she grows up understanding those three things in her bones. That she knows the difference between right and easy, because they are not always the same thing. That she uses her mind carefully and does not let urgency or pressure make her decisions for her. And that she keeps going when it's hard. Because the life you actually want requires sustained effort over a long time, not a single dramatic moment. I am not her parent. I am her grandfather. And that is its own kind of relationship. One built in a workshop on Saturday mornings and at a harbor in the cold and over rhubarb pie. In the particular unhurried way that grandparents and grandchildren have always found each other when they're given the chance. I know what I built. I know what I almost lost. And I know, sitting by the wood stove on a Thursday evening with my coffee going cold beside me, that the difference between people who want to be in your life and people who want access to it is something you learn to see clearly. And once you do, you stop apologizing for acting on what you see.